Welcome to the Data Science Lab, y'all. I'm Libby. I'm a data community manager here at Posit. My co-host is Isabella. Isabella, you want to say hi?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year, everybody. Usually Dan is with us, Dan Chen. I think he's teaching right now. We'll say hi to Dan in spirit. And if you are new around here, hello, welcome. The Data Science Lab is new. It's like weekly. We get together, we talk about more technical stuff, and it's very unscripted and fun. It's like pair coding with your friends, right? We're all going to learn something new today. Today, we are talking about DBT, a tool that I have feared for a long time because I don't know anything about it. I'm like, I'm a data scientist, I'm a stats person. I am not an engineering person or a computer science person. So it's been really intimidating. But thankfully, we have Michael Chow and Laurie Merrell here to help us learn about it and navigate. So I will have you two introduce yourselves. Michael, would you like to tell us a little bit about who you are?
Sure. Hey, I'm Michael Chow. I work as a software engineer at Posit. And I'm so excited to talk about DBT, I think, because prior to this, Lori will introduce herself, but worked helping build out a data team to work on some transit pipelines. And I have to say, I did a really bad job with a lot of the orchestration things. And then Lori came in and really like sponged straw into gold. So I'm so excited for Lori to be here. I'm the like barbarian side of DBT where I feel like I have a healthy appreciation of DBT, but Lori actually has substantive expertise. So Lori, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Laurie Merrell. I'm lead analytics engineer at Jarvis Innovations, and I have been working with DBT since about 2022. And I actually learned DBT to refactor the code base that Michael kind of handed off to me. And I definitely think DBT is something that it's I think it's hard to learn in the abstract. It's very much like a kind of practical tool that I think sort of have to learn by doing. And I primarily work on public transit data, as Michael mentioned. We do modern data infrastructure for public transit organizations. So that's kind of
Awesome.
my background. Yeah.
Well, it's so good to have you both here. And Lori, you have some fans in the chat. They're like, I wasn't gonna miss hearing Lori talk about GPT. I am here for Lori. So we're so excited to have you. Let's go ahead and get started. But first, I would love for everybody to like, we've done this a couple of times in other places, and it makes me smile so much. If you happen to have a rubber duck, like a debugging duck with you on your desk, please feel free at some point to share a picture of it in the Discord or hold it up and say hi. Yeah, James has Figment with him, his debugging duck. This is Rocket. I also have Dusk Goose with me here, from Untitled Goose Game, who has a hair clip in his mouth.
Wait, I
All right,
love
everybody.
this.
Michael, do you have any debugging ducks?
Yeah,
Look, Lori has one.
I have, I mean, I have this baguette. Could it be a debugging?
A
Maybe that's
debagging? Yes,
debaguetting, you know?
we will allow it.
Uh,
Lori, your duck has a little space helmet.
Yeah, I
Incredible.
believe that this is Jarvis swag from some point. I don't know, Michael, if you ever got one, but we got space ducks
No,
at some point.
That
that
is
I think they
excellent
saved the
swag.
swag only for people who were DBT users, not DBT appreciators. That wasn't enough
Aw.
to get the
All right.
duck.
Well, let's go ahead and get started. Michael and Lori, can you please let us know what we are doing today, what we're learning?
hmm Yeah, why don't maybe I'll crack open. So Jenna shared a link to the talk, which was literally like after I joined Posit, and Lori came into Jarvis, which is where I went. So I went from Jarvis to Posit. Lori came in, fixed all my mistakes. The talk Jenna shared was about sort of like how I realized how important DBT was. So that's a good one. I'm just going to share, maybe I could just share like one slide that I think is really important and was aimed at our users from that talk.
All
And
right.
Lori, I think, has some stuff to add to it. And then I'll go into running like a really simple DBT project and just looking around and and just seeing, because if you've tried to run DBT, you may have seen like there's a lot of parts, and sometimes it's hard even to
Yes.
just fire up the basics.
Yeah,
Um,
I told Michael, I just shared a beginner project that Michael's going to be using, a GitHub repo in the chat. And I told him I opened it and I cloned it to my machine and opened it in
mhm,
Positron. And then I was like, crap, I don't know where to go from here. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing.
totally. Yeah. So this is just to foreshadow, this is the project we'll open. Let me share it in Discord. I'll also share it out in the Zoom just in case. Um, So we'll go into this Java shop DuckDB, just a basic look at DBT and how you can see it running and what the different parts are. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna run it in a code space. So I clicked code and then I clicked create a code space. So that might be good to do if you want to follow along. You could fire that code space up right now. It takes like a minute or two to start. Um, and
I
in the
swear I do not have
meantime,
the button for the code space.
you might have to log in, or they may have made it so you have to like click to
Can you show it
activate,
one more
but
time?
yeah. So if I click code and go to code spaces, so click from local to code spaces,
Oh,
should be able
that's
to
what I was
like,
missing. Local to code
oh
spaces.
no, okay.
No, I
Yeah,
have
so
it.
there's a
We're
little
good. I
tab.
just wasn't seeing it. I did
Awesome.
have to log in. Okay,
I
logging
mean,
in. Perfect.
if you couldn't find it, I'm sure other people had trouble. So I'm glad
I'm
you
not alone.
flagged. Yeah. So the one thing I just want to explain about why DBT really fast comes from this talk, the accidental analytics engineer. And what I'll just say is like if you're coming from R or even doing data analysis in Python, you may think of data analysis from this perspective. So this is the data science sort of workflow that Hadley Wickham introduced in R for data science. Um, And so you might think of data analysis like this, where you sort of start from some raw data and you tidy it up and transform it a bit, and then go into this cycle of understanding. And once you've sort of visualized and modeled the data, done this sort of exploratory data analysis, and found something interesting, maybe you go on to communicate it through, say, like a Quarto document or a dashboard, um, ship the results out. This is a very end-to-end workflow. And I think a lot of people on smaller teams get a lot out of this workflow, sort of going from raw data to insights. What I'll say is that in a lot of the contexts, I think where DBT is helpful and to try to make sense of why orgs use DBT, I think that big orgs tend to be more like this. So you chop it up. Oop. So you might have a data engineer for most what you think of as importing. So like extracting and loading data into, say, like a database or like a bucket. You have an analytics engineer who then is doing a lot of the tidying and transforming. They call this sometimes like data modeling. I shouldn't put it in air quotes, but that's like uh, structuring the data in a way that's really friendly for analysis. And then you have the analysts here that might be in like a BI tool or in notebooks somewhere, pulling that tidy and transform data and analyzing it, say pulling it from a database. So I think enterprises and bigger teams tend to see the process like this. There's more sort of like handoff between each of these stages. Um, and this is a figure from a DBT article about the modern data stack, which sort of shows how they view it in this way. So they have like data loaders, then they have DBT here, and then analysts in BI tools. I'll also say, I think they also see it like this. Like there's a lot of these analyses floating around. There's a lot of data being extracted, a lot of data being transformed, and a lot of data being analyzed. So once you go to that workflow, you tend to get like a lot more need to really like engineer and test and work out processes around um, data transformation. Laura, do you have anything you want to
Yeah.
add?
Yeah, I think the way that I think about it is one, I think it's important to have this context in mind because DBT isn't necessarily a tool that is super intuitive if you're kind of tinkering with it on your own, because it's really designed to facilitate kind of like organizational collaboration and sort of production use and orchestration of like production data pipelines. And so it's not a tool like you can learn how to use DBT on your own, but like it may not really, a lot of its features are really geared towards like kind of running and being deployed in a kind of production environment and a specifically collaboration on a project. And so I think that's one of the um, things that can be confusing for people trying to like learn DBT is that it's really designed to be used together to maintain a data warehouse in an organizational context, and it's not necessarily something that like a lot of the tools may not like a lot of its features may not make a lot of sense if you're just like working on it locally. And the other way I frame it sometimes is thinking about from an analyst perspective, DBT is sort of the tool that is like preparing, it's kind of moving up the floor of the analyst workflow. So instead of like me as an analyst having to go like grab, you know, super raw, messy data from some kind of source, it's like raising the floor of that data. So instead of going to that source and doing all of the kind of like um, really nitty-gritty cleaning, like the analytics engineer and the data engineer are trying to give you as the analyst cleaner, more prepared data so that you're focusing more on the like analysis and insights and less on the data cleaning and transformation. Um, so
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Perfect.
Um, so maybe with that in mind, I'm going to crack open this project so we can just see DBT in action because I think to Laurie's point, like it's a big machine. There's a lot of, if you're just coming at it from the perspective of like doing a single data analysis, it feels like a lot of boilerplate. So it can be pretty overwhelming to like run. Um, but I honestly, I think once you have someone crack it open and kind of like point out the different pieces, I feel like it's way easier to just understand what you're getting into. So
Hopefully, we'll see. I'm going to be
we'll see.
asking so many questions. I'm going to have like a
Yeah,
notes doc open in
please.
Positron on the
Yeah.
side.
I mean, I'm going to be asking questions too. And Lori, I feel
Yes.
like,
And this is
uh,
also like everybody in Discord. This is the time to stop Michael and Lori and ask questions to be like, what did you just click? What was that? What does that file or folder mean? Like, this is the time. So don't feel
yeah.
shy about asking.
Yeah, I'd be really curious too to hear in like Discord, like what people are interested in DBT. Like, what are people curious about? Like, are you curious about using DBT?
Well, I did
Are
already
there people
see.
in your org using it? Yeah.
Well, so like Marcos was saying, okay, so my assumption was somewhat correct. It's not really a tool for data scientists to fiddle with on their own. Its purpose is to be in these big flows. And I think that one of the questions that we get a lot is like, okay, um, I want to learn this tool that I would need to use inside of an organization. I need to be able to talk about it in an interview or get experience with it, but it's not something that a solo data scientist really needs. Then how do I build up that like core skill set if I don't have organizational problems to apply it to, right? So that's one question. And then Aaron was like, could we back up for 1 second and explain what
Yeah.
DBT is? DBT
Yeah.
stands for data build tool, and it's all lowercase always. I don't know why. But yeah, Martine is also like, what is DBT? It's a
Yeah.
framework
Yeah.
for
Great
ETL.
question.
yeah, I have some slides when I talk about this where it's like DBT is literally what is it is I think for this we're going to be talking about DBT core, which is just a Python, like what it literally is a Python package that can execute like SQL. It basically provides a framework for or like executing a bunch of SQL scripts in a specific order against like a data warehouse environment. And so it's a Python package that provides like a wrapper around SQL code that you're
Hmm.
running in an environment. DBT, the company DBT Labs, also there's like a SaaS product which is DBT Cloud, which is like a hosted version. They just last year released DBT Fusion, which is sort of like a new in between um like layer, which you know folks can go look at the product information for that. But DBT Core, kind of like the basic, is a Python package.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I think too, I find one tricky thing with when people start talking about data tools is sometimes when they answer what something is, they get very abstract. Like in my mind, like DBT is what it does, and this I think Jaffa Shop, this example, Jaffa Shop DuckDB is useful because it just shows what DBT does. So you can
Right.
just
I
see
think this is
like
going to
what
make
goes in,
sense.
what comes out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Michael walked through like a little bit of
Um,
this for me, and I just like just seeing what it did. I'm like, oh, now I know what DBT is. Isabella is
yeah,
spotting
like
some questions in the chat for us too.
Yeah, there are a couple follow-up questions. So, since it's a Python package, is it interesting for our users?
yeah, I mean, let's run the demo, and I think that'll contextualize a lot. Like you'll see once it runs, like kind of where Python comes in, which is not really at all.
Yeah, I was gonna say
I
this is
think
not
I think
something
once
where
we
you're
get
like,
through,
I'm a Python power user and then I'm
but
using this. No, 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 no.
and
And
honestly,
I
all these questions make so much sense. Yeah,
They do. I mostly say that because I think often people are wondering whether DBT is like a language of some kind, or also if it's some kind of data storage. Like DBT does not store data itself. It's not any kind of like database itself. It's like it's a framework for storing your code, basically. It's like a way to organize your data transformation code.
Yeah.
Um,
I've been calling it a
and
framework,
yeah,
not a language.
yeah.
yeah.
And
All right,
one
let's run
Let's
this.
do
Can
it
we?
before we talk anymore because we're 18
Yeah,
Yeah,
minutes
yeah,
in.
yeah,
And
yeah.
fair.
a
Yeah.
lot of these
I
questions
think
are
we'll
going
just
to
get
be
more
answered.
questions. Yeah,
Yeah.
I had all these questions too, so I'm glad people are asking. But okay, so I just went into the code space. I created one. This is one that's already run a little bit and installed, and so it's really fast. Like this tutorial, I think where does it have that little drop down that's like how okay, so if you go down here running this project, this is the fastest possible explanation they have. So they're like, in these bits of code, you can run this project. Um, in our code space, we've already done these two things. And I think we maybe even did the virtual env. Um, so if I
Does
do
that mean
which
that it has
Python,
done it for you?
let me see.
Or are you
Let
saying that
me
you did it
see.
before you spun this, before you shared your screen with us?
I think that it did it for us, but why don't I just run it again, this step? So I'm gonna run this part.
Okay.
Why don't I just run this? I'll do this step by step so you can see it.
And as a reminder
And
for
I'll,
everybody, he's in the terminal. This is CLI. He's not in a
mhm.
Python console or Python REPL.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, so that ran, and now we have our virtual environment. And then I'm gonna install these requirements. This might take a sec. Let's see. Very cool. I get a million pop-ups. I'll allow you to do anything, VS Code. Let's do this. Okay, so while that installs, I'm gonna grab the next command. It's weird because we already did
We
that.
already
So
activated.
that's not
Do we
necessary,
do
but I'm
it
just gonna
again?
do it anyways because I'm a good direction follower. So
Sometimes there's a reason and they're just not telling you what it is.
yeah. All right. And then this is where I think this will hopefully make sense. So just to show you, like right now, we have this folder, which is models. And notice, why don't I just open it on GitHub so you can see it there? So in models, notice there are these SQL files. Um, and basically, we're going to get tables for every SQL file. So if we look in, there's a bunch of SQL, and there's a final sort of query down here. So every SQL file, we want to basically produce a table from for this Java shop data. So when I run dbt, what's the command, Lori?
DBT
dbt
build?
run build, dbt
DBT
build.
build.
This is where
Got something
my
right.
idiocy is going to show. So dbt build. All right, let's see. Okay, so it ran, and then the key is it has created a database called Java Shop DuckDB, and that has tables for each SQL file basically in this project. So if you go into models, you'll notice there's like customers, there's orders. Let's just look at that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to install this DuckDB CLI so I can see it a little more closely. So I already ran this, but why don't I just
We
run it
should
again and we
put
can
that
pretend.
in the chat. Oh, wait, Michael did.
Oh,
Yay, there
yeah, I
we go.
dropped it into Discord. Let me drop it
Good
into
job.
Zoom too.
Yeah,
This is
there
so
are
we
some
can
people
kind
who
of,
can't get to Discord.
yeah, this is so we can poke around a little bit. Notice that one problem is they say you need to run this command to do DuckDB. So I'm gonna paste this in and run it. I already did. So, all right. And now when I type DuckDB, I have this little command line where I can see the stuff. So now I'm gonna do show tables. Uh-oh. Oh, I need
Oh
to
no.
connect.
Yep, yep,
Wait,
yep.
wait,
Yeah.
wait. Wait. Sorry. DuckDB. And then I put the name of the database in, right?
Yeah, I
It
think
should
that's why
go
it's suggesting you can
John.
auto-com. Yeah.
Oh, very cool. Okay. All right. This is why we pair. All right. So notice now we have a customers table, we have an orders table, and that matches these SQL files and models. Um, so that shows us like DBT did something to create these tables from these SQL files. You might notice we have all these other tables, and so there's a way to find these. The staging tables are in here. So notice there's a SQL file for stage customers, stage orders, stage payments. And then raw is a little bit tricky. It corresponds to this data in this seeds folder. So my whole point is like there's already kind of like a lot going on, but I just want to point out like we have a table for everything in seeds. These raw customers say maps to here. We have a table for every SQL file inside models/staging. So stage customers is here. And we have a SQL file, we have a table for all the other SQL files. So like orders.sql and customers.sql. So let's just like stop and appreciate like already so much has happened. But the key is like these things in seeds and the SQL files and models now each have a table. So I would just think about that. Like DBT build produced a table in the database for these different files. Some of them were CSVs, those were raw data. Some were SQL with SQL queries. Um,
And
yeah, Laura, do you have?
I yeah, I think this is where the some of the sort of challenge like the challenge with like using a sandbox environment like this is that the reason that we have those CSV files and the DuckDB file locally are so that this is like a self-contained local example. Like in a kind of organizational context, your raw data would probably be coming from some upstream, you know, your APIs or your buckets or whatever, like that's your raw data. So those CSV files here are taking the place of that so that this is a self-contained example. And then that DuckDB file that is local that we're looking at this CLI, you know, in reality, that might be your Snowflake or your Databricks or your BigQuery or such. So like, I think this is one of the challenges is sometimes to make it work locally, you kind of have to add these things that also make it more confusing because like it's not that DBT itself, you have to have DuckDB locally or you have to have like your raw data in CSVs locally. Like that's part of making this a sandbox, but um it,
Yeah.
it yeah, I think it sometimes makes it harder to understand the concepts because you have to do some stuff to
Yeah.
make it work.
I I personally find it easier because before the DuckDB stuff existed,
Yeah.
you had to connect to BigQuery. Like all their docs and
Yeah.
their tutorials were like sign up for BigQuery. So you had to
Right.
Yeah.
like connect to a warehouse. So I'd almost flip it and I'd say like if you
It does make it more
have these
accessible.
CSVs and DuckDB, you can just run everything locally. It's true you won't get quite the same production environment because you won't be like hitting Snowflake or BigQuery. But you can kind of like open it up and tinker a
Yeah.
bit at least.
No, it definitely makes it more accessible to learn to be able to have the sandbox, but I think it can be confusing about how the sandbox concepts translate to like real life examples of
Yeah.
using DBT. That's more what I mean, is that like the way that you would use a seed in a kind of real DBT project is not all your raw data is CSVs in the repo,
Yeah.
like and so I think it's more like the conceptual mapping is like a little unclear. But
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah,
it
that's
is
a
now
great.
very nice that you can have DuckDB and actually do this without having to figure out connecting to a cloud.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a
Well, why
great
don't
point.
we pause really
Huh?
quickly and answer some questions in the
Yeah.
Discord that are popping up that might give us some clarity.
Yeah.
Um,
And if I
so
can just if you
go
don't
ahead.
mind just reiterating what Lori said, like I feel like one really important thing she just said is that seeds, like Lori pointed out, like seeds is really useful here for a tutorial, like a local tutorial, but you're not gonna at work, you're probably not gonna find a seeds folder because your data will say like already be in a warehouse or somewhere else. They're not gonna check all your data in to your like dbt git repository, which I think is important to flag. Yeah.
All
Sorry.
right.
Okay, go ahead.
Totally makes sense. Okay. Hubert had asked, I assume there's some sort of concurrency or dependency capability, thinking of like Oracle job chains that have dependencies. Maybe Lori can
Yeah,
tackle that.
yeah. So that's kind of like that's one of the kind of superpowers of DBT. So Michael, can you scroll up to where you did the DBT build and show like what it actually
Hmm.
printed?
Yeah.
So what DBT did is it's not just that it created all those tables, but it created them in order based on dependencies that it is kind of like inferring from like how those SQL files are specified. So you can see it runs like each one, like it has this ordered list of run this, then run this, then run this. And that is happening because I don't know, Michael, can we pull up the
Yeah. Maybe
like
like
maybe
this.
staging custom. Well, no, those are going to be weird because they're going to pull from source. Or I guess if they're seeds, it might be okay. Um,
Sorry. Here, maybe we can bail out if it gets
yeah.
funky. But
Um,
oh, that you're right.
so
There's even a
is
note
going to
here.
yeah. So the way that it's inferring, like, okay, I need to run like raw customers before I run staging customers is because of that line on line 7 where it says select star from ref raw customers. That like ref macro is saying like this staging customers model depends on that raw customers model. So I need raw customers to exist before I can run staging customers. And so the ref macro here is like one of the really important parts of DBT because it allows you to like it will infer your dependency tree from the use of this macro. And the other thing that's important about this is you can see it's just saying ref raw customers. It's not specifying like a full table name in the database. It's not saying from, duckdb dot schema dot table name. It's just giving the name of the model like within the DBT project. And so this is doing two things. It's like making the dependency tree, but it also means that DBT can run sort of against different environments. Like you're not fully specifying storage locations within a specific warehouse. So this helps you have things like maybe a test warehouse environment and a production warehouse environment. And your DBT project, you can write the code in a way that's like environment agnostic, and then DBT resolves those references for you. Um, so the ref macro is like one of the like really, really important like features of DBT that helps with both of those things of the dependency tree and then also making it sort of environment agnostic and letting you can run the same DBT project against different warehouse instances and it will resolve those, it will make raw customers into that like schema dot table name according to like the settings of the connection between the DBT project and the environment, if that makes sense.
All right,
Yeah, I'm sure
sweet.
our users have had that experience of like you're querying tables and yeah, like a table name changes but everything downstream basically breaks. Uh,
All right, cool. Let's hop to another question, see if we can get a couple more in here. Adrian had said, I've written some Python files. It's more getting an orchestrator, I think that's the term, to run code. hopefully in the cloud and not on my laptop in a somewhat automated fashion. And I'm wondering if DBT has any of that execution.
So kind of. Um, DBT is not a generic orchestrator in that sense, like your Airflow, Dagster prefect. DBT is sort of like half of an orchestrator and more specifically for SQL. And so DBT can have some Python code in it, but it's not, DBT is not going to like run an arbitrary Python script on a schedule. So normally with DBT project, if you're using DBT core, you would have a separate orchestrator like an Airflow Dagster prefect that's running, that's like kicking off your DBT project, like DBT core. You can't like schedule it itself. It does the dependency and the ordering stuff, but it doesn't have like the scheduling and it doesn't have like an execution environment on its own. So you would have like an Airflow that kicks off your DBT project run, if that makes sense.
All
So it
right.
has some of the features, but yeah, not all.
Okay, good to know. Aaron asked if we're starting this project from scratch, it would just start with the SQL code pulling into tables. Yes, that very first thing that he ran, that DBT build, it looked at a couple of different places in order to make tables. So it looked for the models, the like .sql files, but it also looked for our CSV files that we had in our seed folder. And as Michael and Laurie said, those CSV files are sort of conceptually taking the place of database connections, where we would call database connections. We wouldn't have these like flat files locally, but we're trying to use DBT locally when it's really built to be like a system that's plugged into a larger system. And we did have a couple of questions from Suraj and Marcos that are kind of connected, so I'd love to tackle those. Both Suraj and Marcos had asked, like, how is this better than writing Python functions or a Python script to do this automation? What are the benefits of using DBT versus just a Python script?
So DBT has a ton of features baked in for things that you want if what you're trying to do is specifically, I, on a regular cadence, want to pull in data and then run a bunch of transformations on it using SQL. Like that's
So is it
kind
like
of
volume size of the data is part of the difference?
it's that it gives you a lot of additional features. So it has things like the ref macro. Like I've looked at a project that I think where people kind of home grew a lot of the features of DBT and like manually orchestrating your SQL ordering and like or your execution of like run this and run this. Like DBT kind of gives you that out of the box. DBT also gives you again, a kind of a framework for how you connect to the different database environments, like out of the box that you might not want to write yourself of like, okay, here's how I manage different connections. DBT also, or can we look at the YAML file, Michael, schema.yaml?
Yeah.
So DBT also gives you out of the box these things like the a framework for testing. So you can just specify
Yes.
in YAML files like different tests that you want to run as you're executing your transformations. And so it gives you like it kind of just gives you a lot of things that you would likely want to do that you don't have to like manually you implement yourself, basically. Um,
Yeah.
and DBT is also definitely kind of, I think, it comes from the idea that you have a cloud warehouse where you're running this, and so there is also the question of it's like assuming that you're running in kind of like a sort of bigger data cloud warehouse instance. Um,
Yeah. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
And that
I
kind of leads into Suraj's next question. Did you have something to add, Michael?
I will say uh there are like there is this interesting space in DBT, which is like anything that can generate SQL can be made into a DBT adapter. So there are like, for example, IBIS is similar to dbplyr, but for Python, and it can
Mm-hmm.
generate SQL. And IBIS DBT adapter, where are you? Here? Like there is this funny space of like people who have integrated like tool that can generate SQL into DBT. Um, but it's the space isn't like super common, so you're kind of like a bit off the like beaten path is the problem. I think to Jenna's point, like yeah, this quote, like if you choose not to use DBT, you'll probably waste time building a less fully featured, buggy implementation of it yourself. That's real. And the reality is just like R and Python are way less integrated into DBT. So if you're used to like generating SQL and dbplyr, there's just not like really common, well-trod paths to move that in. And I think part of it's also that analytics engineers don't want to worry about all these like bespoke tools when a lot of them are very like SQL savvy.
All right, cool. Let's hop over to a question from Suraj, which said, does it make sense to say that the data source detection is dynamic with DBT, unlike Snowflake, BigQuery, etc., where we have to manually set sources, and the sources can be different formats?
I'm not 100% sure how to answer that. You do have to specify in DBT what your sources are. Um, like you on two levels. So one, you connect DBT to the warehouse environment where it's going to execute. So like it only has a DBT project can only execute against a warehouse that has been configured to connect to. Like there's an aspect of like credential. Like you have to be running it through a connection in a warehouse. And then the other thing is you do specify where your sources live. So this is where the sandbox is a little odd. I don't think they actually have a sources, like they don't have anything configured as
Yeah,
sources.
because they're using all
But
the seeds, I guess. Yeah.
yeah, but normally the way it would work is that you would have in a YAML file like this, you would specify like say that my upstream source is like an external table that like data is landing in a bucket and I've got an external table. I would tell DBT about that external table and like it needs to know where to find. Yeah, you can see external location. So like DBT needs to know where your source lives and like they have to be named so that DBT can like resolve the references. The dynamic aspect is more in the reference resolution like within the DBT project. In terms of like that the reference macro that the ref macro that we looked at. But you
Yeah.
do have
Okay.
to kind of give it defined sources. Yeah.
I will say
All right.
this tool, DBT DuckDB, is a fun way to kind of beef up these tutorials, which is like rather than so here we generated a .duckdb database basically, but what DBT DuckDB adapter lets you do is your database could be a folder of Parquet files. So essentially, like your whole database could just be reading and writing from a folder of Parquet. Um, and that's what's shown here in this source is like my external location is this S3 Parquet bucket.
Hmm.
So DuckDB is good with that kind of stuff.
I like
Works
that.
really
That
well, like
definitely fills in that gap. Okay, cool. There was a non-question, sort of a question. It was a pseudo question. Let me go find it.
yeah. I know I saw Jenna also mentioned running the docs, DBT
Yes,
docs.
that
Should we
was it.
do
Was a
that? Would that
suggestion.
be
Duck
or
or
maybe
DBT docs generate and then DBT docs serve. And if we could
uh,
talk a little bit about the importance of those. And Jenna, if you would like to hop in, feel free. We can send you a little like
do
thing
it?
that lets you unmute.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
So DBT docs. So part of again this idea of DBT as a framework. So when DBT
uh-oh.
runs, there are slightly different run modes, but
Mm,
basically DBT is compiling like is compiling all of the references and it's like inferring that dependency tree and it outputs some like special JSON files that basically kind of have all that compiled information and then that allows you to do different things kind of like to parse your project and one of the things that DBT gives out of the box is the docs um
mhm. What
and
is it Target? Is Target that has all
yeah,
the
it's in Target and it's
it,
for docs it's catalog.json.
Oh yeah,
Um,
here. So this is kind of like the internal,
yeah.
how the sausage gets made.
Yeah, so these are
Uh,
huge, really gnarly JSON files that contain like a lot, like all the metadata and like all of the resolved information that DBT does. Um, but then DBT provides kind of like a user interface on top of that through the docs site, where you can see information about each of the models. Um,
where's
and
the
so it'll give you
wait, where's the graph? I can't remember. Oh,
on
here.
bottom right, the little, yeah. So it'll show you your dependency lineage as a, and you can, if you want to, well, I guess this one's really basic, but if
Where
you
did we
click
click
the,
to get here?
To
so
what?
yeah, go back to the homepage, Michael, of the doc site, maybe. The
So
Oh
we're
DBT
on the
yeah.
docs,
doc
So
site.
let me
yes,
restart the whole because
That's
yeah,
what we should share.
it's kind of like an if you know, you know, like these things are clickable and this
Yeah, I
but
did
folder
not
actually
know.
expands.
also how
Uh,
do we want to reiterate how you generated it?
yeah.
So on in the terminal, DBT
Uh,
docs generate and DBT docs serve.
yeah. So I
Um,
did DBT docs generate, where it's
Okay.
like, oh, I found a bunch of models and seeds,
Okay.
and it tells me where the catalog is. And then
Ah, okay.
DBT doc serve. This is a bit tricky in code spaces because it'll ask permission to like open like notice it's on
Right. It's
it's
like
open like a special
it's not
link.
like a link that you can share. It's going to open locally on your machine if you're running it locally.
Yeah, so you can click here to if you command click,
Hmm.
it kind of knows to open it in a special way. So
Okay.
that's one kind of code space tip.
Great. Thank you. Didn't mean to interrupt, but
And,
that's
and,
No, no, I'm
fantastic.
glad you asked.
and
and
just to
then
confirm, oh, sorry, that
yeah,
that command was run in Python or somewhere.
Well,
uh,
this is in the
All been terminal.
terminal,
Oh, okay, got it.
just in
it's a
bash.
terminal command through the
Yeah.
DBT command line interface. Like so
Okay,
DBT has its own command line interface.
cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah, and I
go ahead, Michael.
sorry, go ahead. Oh, I wouldn't worry too much. Like DBT is implemented in Python for now, but it's true like they're porting a lot of things to Rust. So it
Yeah,
being in Python's more like a implementation detail than anything else.
yeah. And then on the DBT docs homepage, so the way you interact with it on the left is you can navigate it through either the project, which is like the folder view, and that will show things as they're organized in the DBT project, like the directory structure within your repo, basically. If you go to the database view, it will show how things are organized within the database. So it'll show by like schema, basically. And so those are the two ways to kind of navigate. And then each model has its own page in the doc site, so we can click on any of those and see. And it'll have at the top, it has like kind of the summary information. It has the columns. Um, and like each of those descriptions that you see there, you can specify those in the YAML file, like within your DBT project. You can write docs kind of inline, and then they'll render here. Depending on your settings, they can also be persisted into your warehouse, so that you have kind of the same column descriptions can appear in multiple
Yeah.
places.
This is
And that,
amazing.
yeah,
So when we're
that's really
talking
I love
helpful.
about
the
benefits of DBT, this is a huge one because
mhm.
Yes.
otherwise all of this would be either manual or
Yeah.
through another docs framework. Maybe you're plugging in because there are docs frameworks, but like
Yeah. So
this is really
eh,
cool.
just to map it back to so like this is we're looking at the customers table
Hmm.
and we can see like yeah, these are descriptions on the columns. And where that comes from is, so notice in the customers folder, this is a bit tricky, but there's a schema.yaml file.
Hmm.
I don't, Lori, maybe in a sec you can talk about how people like to write the .yaml files, because I know there's like some conventions around that. But um, here, notice it's like these are our models. So in DBT, a model is I'm afraid to say it's a table or the output is a table. So each SQL file produces a table, and this models is a list of tables. Um, so, well, it's not just and tests and things like that, but So this is the customers table. This is the description that DBT will put in the docs. And these are the column descriptions as well. So
And
notice,
yeah, I think the reason that it's model rather than just table is because I think part of what the sort of DBT philosophy is the idea that your data transformations and a lot of this metadata should live in version controlled code, right? And that the materialization, like whether something is a table or a view, is like an implementation detail. And the important part is the business logic that's encapsulated in that model. So it's like, I mean, for folks who've worked, sometimes you have like underscore V, like each thing in the database is like, oh, is it a table or is it a view? And that's kind of often like how things have been organized. And DBT is like whether it's a table or a view is just an implementation detail related to like performance and storage. And from your perspective, you should care that it's the customer's thing. And like when I need to get customers, I go there, and I, as a downstream consumer, shouldn't care if it's a table or a view. Maybe I need to change it later based on performance considerations that arise over time. But that's why model is used as like a generic, like it's you're building your data model like conceptually more than
Right. And this,
how,
yeah,
yeah.
it's a good call out for a bunch of data scientists and data people
Yes, yeah,
to
it's
say
very
that
confusing.
model is data model, not statistical model or machine
Yes.
learning model.
hmm
We're talking
yeah.
about a data model. And another good call out is like oh man, I just lost my train of thought. What was I thinking 2 seconds before this? Oh well, it'll come back to me. But I wanted to hop over really quickly to two things. Jenna saying, Michael, click the lineage button.
Here it is.
And
This,
also
did I do it?
Hadley saying, is DBT just like kind of like RStudio, right? Like it gives you an environment for developing SQL that lets you write functions, which are macros, tests, documentation, all of that stuff, and share it with your colleagues. And then Jenna mentioned DBT Studio, which I didn't even know was a thing.
DBT.
Yeah,
I don't, yeah.
I've I've basically only ever used DBT core, which so I've on which means that I've used it in like an IDE, like a VS Code IDE, so like context. The DBT Studio, like DBT has other like products and offerings that make it more like move it more towards its own standalone kind of IDE. But I think DBT core, kind of the bare bones version, is sort of, it's like in between. It's more of just a framework for how you organize your code more than inherently like a environment, if that makes sense. Um,
Okay.
it's kind of hard. I think DBT it's not a noun. Like it's not a type of thing that I'm aware of a lot of other types of things like it, if that makes sense. So it's kind of hard to compare. Um,
Mm. It doesn't help that it's like a bit overloaded because there's a few
yeah.
products. I would almost just say think about like data comes in, whether it's like seeds or it's like Parquet files in a folder or like some tables in a warehouse, like raw tables in a warehouse that a pipeline is put up. DBT runs and it creates all the downstream tables and runs the tests you ask it to do and creates the like column descriptions that you need.
Yeah, I think basically really what it comes down to is it's really focused on organizing your SQL code and giving you some convenient ways to add like related operations and metadata through these YAML files. Like that's like the value add. And that is I think the what Michael mentioned, like I kind of refactored his code base, and that's how I learned DBT. And what the original code base was doing is we had like an Airflow instance that was orchestrating a bunch of SQL transformations one by one. So we were using just a generic orchestrator, and we were kind of manually specifying all these dependencies. And it was not scaling well. Like there were some very bad choke points. And there's also the question of kind of boilerplate code. One of the other things that DBT is doing is you don't have to write your own DDL or DML statements. Like DBT, you can focus on writing the business logic in just SQL, and then DBT kind of generates some of the boilerplate, like create table as aspects. And you're like, it takes that off of your plate. So
Yeah,
yeah.
Right.
I do think to Hadley's point, like what made sense to me was like I've seen a lot of people build DBT like things to Jenna's point too. Like actually there are so many ways to make it work. And if you're used to tools in R, you've actually probably built really reasonable, you could have built like really reasonable systems that automatically detect dependencies. Honestly, it's not a really hard tooling problem, but I think that um I think the problem DBT solved is it created a job. Like the analytics engineer role, like you know what an analytics engineer should learn, and it's mostly SQL, and these and orchestration with things like DBT. And the fact that this group of people have converged on like practices and language means you don't have this like Tower of Babel where
Where
everybody's bringing
everyone's
their
doing it.
own
Yeah, I
special little
agree.
orchestration tool with its like
Yeah.
I
own
think it's why we love
quirks.
tidyverse. We're like, we have a syntax and everyone's going to use that same syntax and we're all going to speak the same language and we're all going to understand each other. And that means we can work together even better.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I think DBT basically took a lot of things that again that you would want to do if what you're doing is I have this amount of data that needs to flow through like every day or every hour and I'm always needing to do the same steps. And I'm doing that in the context of like a data warehouse. DBT just bundles together a lot of features
Hmm.
that make your life easier if that's what you're doing. And so it's the like taking away a lot of boilerplate code, it's adding data testing, it's giving you this kind of docs site for free. And the dependency management is really important, but it's like it's part of this kind of coherent whole. And it's the idea that like managing my data warehouse is it's like a collective thing. I think it's also shifting to the idea that the data warehouse like is kind of like a product and like that you need that people should be kind of curating and building it collectively. I think often at organizations that have big data warehouses, sometimes there's kind of like a free for all and like different teams are managing different schemas and like people are kind of like using data like whatever they can scrounge up, what they can find, who they know, and it's trying to kind of like make a more coherent whole and kind of help you talk precisely and collaboratively
Hmm.
about your data warehouse.
Yeah.
Great.
I do
Okay.
think what maybe the one of the most interesting features of DBT, which is hard to show off because you kind of need like a big environment to really appreciate this pain is like branching. That like if you have like six developers working on a warehouse and you're working on like some set of tables and you're like, okay, I know what I'm doing starts here at these tables and I just want to like test out changing these tables down here. Like, how do you have like a development environment for your work? Like, how do you just test putting up a few tables in a warehouse? That used to be really hard. Like, it used to be like you either had a development or a staging warehouse, and you still might, but like DBT is really good at helping you like fork out kind of like your development tables without having to rename everything or use like funny kind of like environment variable magic. It can just handle like your like Laurie's development tables for this PR, um, which used to be a kind of a crazy problem to solve.
All
Yeah.
right, cool. Well, let's move on to, I think, one of our last questions, and I will go find it because Becca had said, thank you for showing us the sandbox. Before we end, can you pretend you are at step one of a brand new project getting data from an imaginary or real bucket, like a warehouse or something? And where would you begin?
We
Um,
might have different, yeah.
yeah, so DBT does give you like I can't remember what the command is, but there's like a DBT project init kind of command, like a starter template project. Not like this is a sandbox project. They separately have like a kind of start here. So I would clone that. I can't remember if it's DBT init or if you clone that starter project. And then um and then I would configure you'll have to configure your connection to whatever warehouse you're using. So if you have like if this is a real like you're actually getting started on a a thing like connect to your Snowflake or your Databricks or whatever. Um, or if you're doing it locally, connect to your DuckDB, configure that in DBT. There's profiles.yaml, and that is where you configure that connection. So connect to your warehouse, and then I would make my first source. So I would in a YAML file specify like, okay, what's my incoming data, your external, whatever your external data is that you're starting with, configure that as a source. And then I could write my first model, a staging model on top of that source that maybe cast data types, renames column, like minimal. And DBT has really the other thing, DBT also has this very large community. They have a lot of documentation, blog posts, best practices, materials out there. And so they have kind of a DBT how we structure our projects guide, and which talks through like the components of the DBT project. And so I'd kind of walk through the steps basically following that.
Okay, great. I love that question, by the way, because this project is like all fully fleshed out and all local, and it's a fantastic question because like where do you start when it's completely empty? Okay, so we have 2 minutes left. I want to do a quick shout out. Hadley said, so DBT gives SQL the tools that most programming languages have, like testing and documentation. Yes. Also, MVP of the chat goes to Jenna Jordan. Thank you so much for hopping in, answering questions, providing resources. It's been amazing. Um, and it also puts all of these steps into version control. You can have them in GitHub. That's super important. That's another thing that like your stuff might be all over the place if you don't do that. And then Darren said, when I've thought about DBT, the issues it solves is in part due to the dependency management for traditional SQL focused data teams. When you make changes to SQL scripts, it's hard to know if these changes can have downstream impacts. With DBT, those dependencies can be tested against. Is that somewhat correct?
That is 100% correct. Yes, that's the part of the value of exposing that lineage and having tests like inline. So if you downstream, you need something to be unique, you can specify that. And if you make a change upstream, you can list out what are the downstream things that are going to be affected by this. So yes.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Lori.
Yeah,
This
thanks for
was
having us.
Yeah, it was a lot. DBT is a lot to wrap your head around. Hadley said at the chat, I feel like I know less about DBT than when I came in here.
Great. Now the
It's
healing can
pro
begin, you know?
Yeah, it's probably because there were some preconceived notions or confusions or like you haven't gone and applied this yourself, or like Hadley said, the problems that DBT solves are far removed from what a data analyst and a data scientist does and needs to do, and that's totally relatable for me. Also, the last thing I remembered, I wanted to define a view versus a table because they are different things. So 20-second answer.
A table means that you have like persisted the data again in storage in the warehouse, whereas a view is just like a SQL script that's saved and it will run like it's not repersisting the data. Basically, it's not. Yeah, that's the shortest that I can do.
It is a view of the table. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Stick around on the Discord. This was really, really fun. Continue asking questions. We can hop in and continue to answer them. And I hope that we see you on Thursday for the Data Science Hangout. Also, if you have not taken the survey, the Data Science Hangout survey, you do not have to be a Data Science Hangout attendee, although I would love you to be. You can fill it out. It's open till Sunday, and we will come back on the Data Science Lab and say Data Science Hangout to share the results with you. So please, please, please do that. Have a wonderful week. See you on Thursday or next Tuesday, where we are going to be joined by Andrew Heiss. If you know him, you love him and all of his content. So join us then. Bye, everybody.
See ya.
See ya. Bye, y'all.